Hey y'all, how are you doing? I'm great. Thank you so much for asking. It's me, Kim, and I'm back for another video. This video is going to be a conversation with Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. Dr. Kendi is a professor of history as well as the inaugural director of the BU Center for Anti-Racist Research. He's also written two incredibly well-regarded, very popular books. The first is Stamped from the Beginning, which won the National Book Award. And if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Kendi is the youngest person to ever win the National Book Award in nonfiction. Double check, but I think that that's true. He also has the #1 book on the New York Times bestseller list in nonfiction. It's called How to Be an Anti-Racist. So we talked about the rise of the anti-racist reading list, as well as potential optimism that this particular historical moment can be sustained. Here's our conversation. First of all, Dr. Kendi, thank you so much for taking some time. I know you must be swamped. Your schedule must be insane.
It's a little insane, but
Yeah.
I'm glad I'm able to talk to you and your to community.
Yeah. So you have a new book coming out this week called Antiracist Baby. And I'm just wondering, was it always supposed to be released right now?
No, no, I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah. The timing, we couldn't really pick a better timing. And I'm actually happy because I think many Americans have been reading for their own sake. And I suspect many are then going to start turning to educating their children, about racism. And we're hoping that this book sort of aids in that.
Yeah, it's really, really fortuitous timing. Yeah. Um, so I read Stamped in the Beginning probably about a year ago, and I stamped from the beginning probably about a year ago, and I was riveted. It was super long, but throughout all of those pages, I thought it was so, so good. And of course, it won the National Book Award. So um, you say early on in that book that you used to be a racist yourself when you started writing it. And at what point did you realize that you have some internalized anti-blackness, and how did you work through that?
Yeah, so it was a very long and winding process, a process that I detail in How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I think when I first realized it, and I realized even the process that I was going through, that I didn't recognize it, was through writing Stamped from the Beginning. In other words, I defined a racist idea, as any idea that suggested or a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group in any way. And I specifically used the term racial group to reflect the sort of intersectional racial groups that make up any race. And so I didn't just want to write a history of ideas suggesting that there was something inferior about Black people. I wanted to write a history that showcased ideas saying there was something inferior about Black poor people, about Black women, about Black gay men, about Black transgender women. And so once I started chronicling those ideas, I began to realize that I had consumed and expressed some of those racist ideas over the course of my lifetime. And instead of thereby challenging racist policy and power, I had spent my time thinking that certain Black groups were the problem. And so I literally was writing a history of racist ideas for the country at the same time I was coming to grips with my own history of racist ideas.
Yeah. So following up on that, I've always learned that racism is about structural power, and therefore Black people cannot be racist. You use racist to describe yourself, but you also use it to describe other Black scholars and Black politicians throughout history. And so why is it useful to describe them as racist and not something else?
So I think it's critically important for us to realize that the term racist should be used for individuals, should be used for ideas, and should be used for policies. And we should separate that from the term racism, which is structural and systemic. Um, and, and, and then when we think of racism, which I define as a collection of policies that lead to racial inequity that are substantiated by racist ideas, the question is, can individuals who happen to be Black contribute to that system? In other words, are there Black policymakers instituting or defending policies that are leading to racial inequities? Are they then substantiating those racial inequities by saying there's something wrong with Black people as opposed to their policies? And the question to me is yes. I think it's a different, though, question to ask whether Black people as a collective are being or historically have been racist. I think that's a completely different sort of question. Like the group, does the group of Black people have the power to oppress, let's say, white people? That's a completely different question than about whether Clarence Thomas, as an individual, has the power to vote in a way that allows the Voting Rights Act to be gutted in 2013, that allows George W. Bush to be president in 2000. And then why is he voting that way? Out of his own self-interest, out of his own racist ideas. And there's really no different than an individual white person who is contributing to white supremacy out of their own self-interest or through their own racist ideas than a Black person doing it. You know, the outcome of Black harm is the same. Finally, and I think this is really critical, there are, you know, as a Black man, you know, I know that there are Black men who would say that women are fine, but I have a problem with Black women. So in other words, you know, they do not or may not have generalized sexist ideas targeting women in general, but they do, partly because they have standardized white women as women, but they do have they do have ideas about Black women. And then who do they share those ideas with? White men, white women. And so who did they learn those ideas from? And so to me, the effect of a Black woman being told that because of the color of her skin or the texture of her hair, that she is not as beautiful as a white woman, the effect of that Black woman being told they're masculine, strong, and sub-women, the effect is the same, no matter what individual it's coming from. And Black men, as I've chronicled, have contributed to the degradation, you know, of Black women, just as Black elites have contributed to the degradation of the Black poor.
Yeah, so this is what's really interesting, is because as you outline, even, you know, it's not just the Clarence Thomases, it's also Black folks who feel like they have the best interests of the Black community at heart. I mean, you talk about E. Franklin Frazier and the really problematic things, you know, the problematic descriptions that he assigns to the Black family, and how he says that it's kind of inferior because of Black women's leadership inside of the home. But I feel like he wanted the Black community to be better, and he was deeply invested in that, but still perpetuating some of those not so great ideas.
Exactly, and I think he's a great example, because Daniel Patrick Moynihan has widely been considered among scholars of Black people, among feminist scholars who study the history of racist ideas or sexist ideas targeting Black women as racist. You know, so it's a, you know, across the board, the Moynihan report is considered to be a racist report. But he constantly cited and was inspired by a Black male scholar in E. Franklin Frazier, who really popularized within academic circles the idea of the broken Black family that has been broken by this matriarchal Black woman, who gained these matriarchal sort of powers to oppress the family and Black men because they were empowered during slavery. And so then, you know, and in his mind, he wanted the Black family, he wanted the Black community to be strong. He wanted it to progress. He wanted it to advance. And so he imagined that it was not doing those things because Black women were leading it, as opposed to Black men, who obviously he considered to be the more natural breadwinners. And so, but in order for us to really understand, we have to recognize this intersection of sexist and racist ideas. The standard sexist idea that the prototypical family has a male breadwinning head of household, and that is the prototypical family. Any family that's not like that is an inferior family. So that's the sexist component. And then the racist component, which is the Black family is inferior. So you put those two ideas together, and that's how you can say the Black family is inferior because the Black woman is heading it up. In too many cases, they would say.
Yeah. So right now, if I'm not mistaken, you have the #1 book on the New York Times bestseller list for nonfiction?
Yes.
Right, big deal. I have seen How to Be an Anti-Racist recommended everywhere. Every Twitter thread, every blog, every, Instagram story. It kind of feels like right now you're like the racism whisperer. Are you into that, like the opportunity to teach, or is it a little bit frustrating?
I certainly am happy that there seems to be many Americans who have begun to recognize that racism is a serious problem, and they don't really understand it at the level that they need to, or are looking for a more affirmative way to be, and came across my sort of work about being anti-racist. And so I'm, of course, happy that people are just in general looking to understand racism and are looking for ways to be different, or to create a different type of world. I mean, I'm most excited that there's so many writers in general whose books are doing well, books on the bestseller list. There are 2 Black women right now who are #1 best-selling authors. So the fiction bestseller list is headed by a woman. The YA list is headed by a Black woman. And there are Black men and Black women all up and down the list. That's what I'm most really excited about, to be a part of that.
Yeah. So I was reading this great essay by Lauren Michelle Jackson, who teaches at Northwestern, and it's called "Who is the Anti-Racist Reading List For?" Have you been able to read that essay?
I haven't.
Okay, so Lauren made me think about something that Toni Morrison also makes me think about, and it's, what do we as Black people lose in our work with regard to clarity, rigor, form, mobility, but also like the time that we lose if we center trying to help white folks not be racist. What do you think about that? I mean, that of course is a critical part of your work, but does it mean that it's taking away from the other stuff that you could possibly be doing?
So I think there are 2 ways to sort of answer that. I think the first way is, unlike, I think, many authors who write on racism, I don't consider my audience to be white people. And what I mean by that is I don't have a specific racial group in mind when I am writing on the history of anti-Black racism. And the reason being is because there aren't just white people who contributed to that history. There are Latinx people, there are Native people, there are Asian people, and there are even Black people. And so my sort of audience are those who have consumed anti-Black racist ideas. My audience are anyone of any race who are supporting policies and policymakers who are contributed to Black death and Black misery and inequities. These are the people who are my audience. But if somebody was to force me to say, okay, who is the subset of your subset? Like, who are you writing towards? And I would actually say that, when I reread the books that I've written, if there's actually an audience for my books, it's actually Black people. And the reason being is because even early on in my research on Stamped from the Beginning, which of course was covering the enslavement era, I realized that yes, racist ideas were created to defend against those white abolitionists who were challenging slavery, but racist ideas were also created for Black consumption. And you had so many slave owners who were bringing onto their plantations preachers who were teaching Black people through their sermons and through their worship service that you are the cursed descendants of Ham, and so you're supposed to be enslaved forever, or that the Exodus passage in the Bible had nothing to do with you, so stop connecting to it, or that Black people, you are by nature destined for slavery. These ideas were constantly fed to Black people for one simple reason: so they wouldn't resist. And so then it was so they wouldn't resist slavery. Now it's so they won't resist police violence, so they won't resist racial health inequity, so that they'll continue to say things like, well, Black people keep destroying their own neighborhoods, or the problem with Black people is those Black women trying to head up those homes, or Black people are not really investing in their communities in the way other racial groups will do. And so we can continue to blame Black people, when in fact the only thing wrong with Black people is that we think something is wrong with Black people.
Yeah. That's so interesting and such a good point. I watched a whole bunch of your interviews and I can't remember which one, but in one of them you said that just being Black does not make you an expert on race. And I thought, oh, that is such a good point, because so many of us think lived experience is, of course, important, but that's not necessarily racial expertise about the structures and the history.
Yeah, and I think one of the more prevalent racist ideas is this idea that every individual Black person is a representative of the entire race, which is how you can have racist white people see a single individual Black person committing a crime or engaged in some sort of violent act, and they're just not seeing a single violent Black individual, just as a week earlier they saw a single white person who was committing a crime. No, they're seeing Black people commit a crime. They're seeing how and why Black people are so dangerous. And so that idea is deeply problematic because it doesn't allow individual Black people to be individuals. We have to carry the entire race on our shoulders. And so what then happens thereby is, because racist white people view every single individual Black person as a representative of the race, when they're trying to figure out and learn about Black people, they go to the representatives. They go to any individual Black person who can then speak for the entire race, but then also it's just assumed that not only are they representatives, but they're experts on racism. And the fact of the matter is every single individual Black person can speak from their own experiences. They can share, hopefully, and I say hopefully because some Black folk aren't even conscious of the racism that they've experienced. But if they are conscious, they can share those experiences with me or with anyone else, and nobody can take away from that science that they have, within their minds. But if a Black person has not studied the Black community in its totality, if they have not written, and I should say, if they haven't studied the history, if they're not looking at sort of general trends, then really all they can speak from is their own experience, which is a valuable experience. But then, I think that's critically important. And I just don't think every Black person is an expert on Black people or racism, just as it's widely known that not every white person is an expert on all things white people.
Yes. My goodness, you just touched on something, Dr. Kendi, that is such a frustration for me when it comes to media, particularly in this time, but generally, that other groups get to have subject matter experts. Like if you can be a climate change expert, or you can be a Latinx history expert, but Black people, we get celebrities, right? So often celebrities are handed the mic to talk about these huge structural issues. And, you know, of course, like, you have your experiences and that's useful or whatever, like I already said, but it does feel racist when we are talking about 400 years of history to go to X entertainer or X sports figure. Like, it does not sit right with me.
No, and it doesn't obviously sit right with me or many of my colleagues in the academy who study Black people or who study racism, and think that it is critically important for people to sort of recognize that there are indeed subject matter experts. And, you know, one of the things that I'm seeking to do with our new BU Center for Anti-Racist Research is to really organize and systematize and present those many subject matter experts, particularly at BU and potentially around the New England region and potentially around the country, so that media members, if they want expertise in a specific area, they will actually be able to know who's working on that and who's a student and an expert in that specific area. Because not only do you have people who study, you know, racism in general, but even more people study specific aspects of, you know, of racism or a specific group of Black people. Yeah. And those people, you know, need first and foremost, before anyone, to be consulted, they need to be at the table of conversations.
Yeah. And also I want to make a note that when I'm talking about expertise, I'm not just talking about formal education. There are so many organizers on the ground, people who are literally putting their bodies on the line, who are doing incredibly important work in their communities that I would like to see highlighted.
Yeah, without question. And, you know, I didn't want to insinuate also that since I'm the academy, you know, only people with formal education can be knowledgeable about Black people. And, you know, as an historian of African Americans, we know that some of the greatest Black intellectuals in history, some of the people who had the ability to really capture and understand and really speak to and speak about the experiences, you know, of Black people were not sort of formally trained, because we were barred from, you know, the academy, or the academy refused to allow us to study Black people from the Black perspective, or to really get at the root of racism. And so certainly we're in a time in which people are able to do that. But at the same time, there are many people who are not able to do that, or who choose to go a different route. And you know, and I can say as a teacher that some of my best classes have not just been in the community, but even some of my best classes have been in prisons, who, you know, with people who dropped out of high school. And so, yeah, I don't think we should make that direct connection.
Yeah. So it seems like your project and your work there's like an inherent optimism about it. Do you feel like all or most people have the capacity to become anti-racists?
I feel like everyone has the capacity. Now, whether everyone is going to be willing to do the work to be anti-racist is another scenario, but everyone has the capacity. And I'll give a story. You know, there was this man named Don Black who founded this website called Stormfront in the late 1990s. And it was the first major white supremacist sort of website, and really, at least digitally, became one of the cradles for the white supremacist movement. And he was very close to David Duke, who was the most popular and public white supremacist of the 1990s. And so when Don Black had a son named Derek, he imagined that Derek would, of course, lead the white nationalist movement into a new era. And so he groomed Derek to do so, named David his godfather. And by all accounts, in high school, he was already had his own radio station. He was already speaking at white supremacist conferences and making his father proud. But then he went off to college. And then some of his friends started questioning him and challenging him on his ideas. And then he started opening up, and then he started reading. And eventually he transformed. And now he has completely disowned his earlier white supremacist beliefs. A Washington Post reporter wrote a book on his journey called Rising Out of Hate. He apparently, my book, Stamped from the Beginning, was part of sort of his transformation. And, you know, he is striving to be anti-racist, even though he was supposed to be the heir apparent to the white nationalist movement.
So I think we can all agree that like the path to change is about, you know, changing hearts and minds, but also about changing structures. Mm-hmm. Do you think that a lot of the focus right now that's on getting people who are not Black to engage with anti-racist literature, do you think that that gives the impression that change is primarily about individual education?
I think that some people have that impression. And if they have that impression that I'm somehow, or my work is contributing to that, then I suspect it's likely because they haven't read my work. Because the whole reason I'm encouraging people to be anti-racist is so they'll no longer see, let's say, Black people as the problem, and they'll begin to see policies and power as the problem. And then they'll be part of the movement to transform power and policy, which of course, you know, animate through structures and systems. And so, but the transformation, the radical transformation of society is just not going to come out of nowhere. Individuals, people are going to have to make this happen. And people, of course, are going to have to transform themselves to be a part of this struggle. And I think that's oftentimes lost, you know, the relationship between individuals changing and their then transformation of society. I mean, we you know, probably one of the most incredible transformations that Black people know about in history was Malcolm X, which he details, you know, in his autobiography. It's a book of transformation, how an individual was able to transform himself and then become one of the greatest voices of the 20th century in terms of challenging racism and white supremacy. But he had to go through that personal sort of transformation, you know, in order to do so. And, you know, there are other people who, seeming like they came out of the womb anti-racist, like Angela Davis, or, you know, of course, she had incredible parents who raised her in Birmingham to be anti-racist. And then she went on, of course, to college and deepened her knowledge and became, you know, a pivotal figure in Black power. But even her being raised, I mean, you know, and the critical role her family and community and ultimately her teachers played, that was about an individual, right? That was, you know, this community transforming and raising this individual. And so I just think it's critically important for us to distinguish between those who are advocating the people change for the sake of changing, and those who are advocating for people to change so they can transform society. Yeah. And I've constantly sort of advocated for the latter.
Yeah, I feel you. I think that Black folks who have come to consciousness understand the importance of proverbially decolonizing our minds. I think sometimes it's hard to be optimistic about everybody else, though. I think that when you see how deeply entrenched inequality is in all of these systems, sometimes you'd be like, y'all not going, you know, especially, you know, I've been reading a lot of history and it's like, we still doing the same stuff. So I've seen you say that you're optimistic about the possibility that racism will be eradicated sometime down the line. What animates that optimism?
I think what animates it first and foremost is the resistance that I see in our time, or that I've seen throughout history, the resistance to racist power and policies. And so whenever I'm seeing people resist, I'm, becoming hopeful. But I think at a deeper level, I'm hopeful because I believe you have to believe change is possible in order to bring it about. And I just don't see any relationship between a cynic and a change maker. And so I think that at a deeper philosophical level, is what is animating me. But then again, when I think of the changing of power and policy, I don't actually perceive that, let's say, 90% of white people's minds have to change on racism before we create an anti-racist society. What I see is that the people who currently want to transform this society, or I should say currently see racism as a problem, will see racism completely as the problem. In other words, they won't, like so many people in American history, both see racism and Black people as the problem, which means they're spending half their time chastising or going after or trying to civilize or degrade Black people, and then the other time challenging racism. No, they'll put all of their efforts on challenging racism. And if we were to just have that, I think it would be enough to transform this society.
So clearly acknowledging these harmful structures matters, and I'm all for people picking up books and learning stuff, but it does seem like the next and maybe more important thing is getting people to divest from the privileges that whiteness affords them or that systematic anti-Blackness affords them. And it's so funny that I've seen Black Lives Matter protests in all white suburbs. I mean, the white suburb that I grew up in, I saw some Black Lives Matter signs and I was like, oh, Black Lives Matter now. So how do we get to the next step of getting people to actually potentially give things up or invest themselves in changing policy?
So I think when it comes to different groups, the answer is different. And so I think, so when it comes to white Americans, I think it's critically important for them, through being anti-racist, to recognize the privileges that they have accrued and the advantages that they have by the bare nature of their whiteness. I think it's critically important for them to see that and recognize that, acknowledge it and admit it, and even weaponize it for anti-racist change. Because there are certain things white people can do as part of the struggle for anti-racist change that people of color can't. And I think it's critically important for people. So to give an example, there's a massive racial wealth gap, which gives white people more resources, more funding, so they can give at disproportionately higher levels than, let's say, people of color to organizations that are challenging white supremacy. So they can do that. The other thing I think it's critically important for white people to do is to recognize that this fight against racism, this fight to create an egalitarian, equitable, just society, actually will help them too. And in other words, white Americans are constantly comparing themselves to people of color and being like, well, I have more, so therefore racism benefits me. So therefore, why would I challenge racism? But who they should be comparing themselves to is people in other Western democracies who actually, on average, have more than them. Not necessarily, if you take the average amount of wealth among white Americans vis-a-vis the average amount of wealth in other countries, those other countries may have more, but they have less wealth inequality among white people than we do. And those very countries have a social safety net for white people. They have Medicare for all. They have sick family leave. They have a government that's challenging climate change. They have police officers who don't carry guns and thereby don't kill white people, let alone the Black people, right? And so I think, and so for white people, for them to see that creating a different type of society actually benefits them potentially more than the benefits they receive from racism currently. And particularly low income, working class, and to a certain extent, middle income white Americans. And for them to see that they actually, white people have more in common with Black people than they do rich people. And for them to see that and recognize that. I think when it comes to Black elites, or even Latinx elites, or Asian elites, or Native elites, who've also at times been hostile to anti-racist activities, for them to realize that actually what we're finding is that the higher you climb on the economic ladder, the more racism you experience. So it's actually in the self-interest of elite Black people to be some of the most fervent advocates against racism, when indeed in some cases they haven't been, because they think they have, they're comfortable. But again, they're thinking they're comparing themselves to those impoverished Black people and saying, oh, what's the big deal? Why y'all are? But instead of being like, you know what? I would actually have more. There's a massive racial wealth gap between elite whites and elite Blacks. And one of the ways in which I can go on and on, but one of the things that I talk to about Black men about is how the ways in which their support for sort of a gendered racism, and certainly the way they support sexist ideas, obviously harms women of color, obviously harms Black women, particularly the most, but it also harms them too. And so for them to recognize that, there's a reason why no group is more incarcerated in this country than Black men. And there's a direct connection between those incarceration rates and sexist ideas and certainly racist ideas. So yeah, I mean, to me, it's in folks' self-interest. And that's what I'm trying to, explain to folks.
Yeah. So there's always going to be a group, or I imagine there's always going to be a group of people who participate in what you call an intelligent self-interest. Is our goal to just outnumber them? Like, is there a point where you say, oh, we're just going to have to leave you behind?
Oh, yeah. And that's what Black folk have done. That's what Harriet Tubman did. Yeah. We're just going to have to basically leave you behind. If you don't want to be free, then we're going to change the policies and force you to be free. If you don't want to basically gain the strength to be courageous, then we'll be courageous for you. And there's enough of us, that can do that. It is not necessary for us to transform every single person in order to transform this society. But when we do transform this society, it will help every single person. And then, let me just say, and then they'll be the first ones who will be resisting when they try to take away their Obamacare.
Right, yes. So in Stamped, you outline how racist progress often follows racial progress. And it's kind of depressing. And I think that we're in a moment where I think that the time is right for us to right now experience enormous progress, but that makes me nervous because I've read your book and other books, and I know racists are really good at adapting. Should we be concerned that after we get any kind of progress at this moment, that we're gonna have to be back in the way that we have had to fight in previous moments to kind of maintain the momentum?
If we continue to have this singular perspective of racial progress, meaning we're just marching forward away from slavery and we're getting closer and closer to this sort of racial utopia, and if we continue to have that perspective, and we also believe that it's just inevitable, then we're obviously not going to fight for something we believe to be inevitable. But secondly, we're not going to realize that whenever we institute whenever we eliminate racist policies and put anti-racist policies in place, those powerful forces that benefited from those racist policies are not just going to sort of go home and go to sleep. No, they're going to figure out new and ever more sophisticated ways to regain power, to regain the exclusion, to exploit people. And so what I'm hoping people do through this conception of this dueling sort of history of that we have this, when you think of the racial struggle, it's literally a power struggle between racist and anti-racist, and it's always been. And you've had a history in which anti-racists have broken down racist barriers, but then typically there's an effort to of course renovate and rebuild those barriers. If we have that conception, then once we break down those barriers, once we put in place anti-racist policies, we're not just going to go home. We're going to then play defense, and we're going to play offense, right? We're going to figure out, okay, they're coming for us. What are new ways in which they're trying to undermine us? And we're never going to be, we're never going to believe we've achieved. Even no one becomes anti-racist. It's only something we can strive to be. Just like a country doesn't become anti-racist. They can only strive to be anti-racist, and any country that is able to institute anti-racist policies are always going to have to keep those policies on guard.
Yeah. So another thing I thought was interesting, I mean, you've mentioned elites a few times in our conversation, and you underscore in your work that the racist policies really only serve the economic, political, and cultural interests of like a very small select group of like elites in this country, yet a lot of people identify more with that small select group than with Black folks. So how do we get them away from that? I know that progressives love facts and figures and numbers that don't seem to be doing it. How do we get them to identify with their actual interests?
I think that's a question, I think that's a question that, people have been asking for a long time. And that was a question that Ida B. Wells raised, and W.B. Du Bois and others raised. And I think that part of the function of racist ideas is to cause people to view their enemies as their friends and their friends as their sort of enemies. And I think what racist ideas also do to people is, obviously, because they're viewing their friends as their enemies, they have unintelligent self-interest. So they think they're doing what's best for themselves or their community, when they're actually doing what's best to harm their communities. And I just think that that's just a conversation we have to constantly have. And especially if it's white people who are thinking this, other white people who are striving to be anti-racist need to be leading those conversations, need to be telling these other white people, no, actually it's better for you as a white person, to think this way or to support this policy. And I think that's absolutely sort of critical. But I also think that these are the types of questions we should be asking, and I just don't understand why you have white working class men right now who support Trump because they aspire to be him one day, even though the policies that he is supporting are making it much harder for them to ever become like him. They supporting him because they want to be him, as opposed to supporting what's going to allow them to have a better life for themselves. Just like you had poor whites who wanted to be slaveholders, wanted to be large slaveholders. And the likelihood of that ever happening for them was very slim, but because that's what they wanted to be, they were going to be willing to serve as the military arm of the slaveholding apparatus. They were willing to of course, defend slaveholders and support them. And I think that just like you have Black men who want to be white men, and so they're willing to sort of support white male patriarchy, and they're willing to challenge Black women who are challenging their sexist ideas or who are challenging their support for sexist policies, which then sort of put them in a position in which they're subjected in the way white women have been subjected. But because they want to be white men, as Black feminists have been telling them for decades. And so I think that this is something that we have to really ask and interrogate and teach away.
Yeah. So if you are deeply invested in anti-racism or deeply invested in any kind of progressive progress, I think sometimes it can be really dispiriting. So I am interested in, how will we know if it's working? How do we know if being out in the streets and doing the teaching and reading the books and writing the articles, how will we know if the work that we are putting in as people who are deeply invested in social transformation, if that's really paying off? Or will we know?
So we would know based on, I think, two major things. First, are we seeing a reduction in racial inequities and disparities? And so, for instance, 5 years, if Minneapolis dismantles its police department and radically replaces it with a public safety sort of outfit that's more focused on serving the people, rather than brutalizing them and over policing them, we'll see if between now and then the disparities of Black people being about 20% of the city's population, but more than 60% of those being subjected to police shootings eliminates itself. We'll be able to sort of track that. And then what we will also sort of be able to really track is really Black life. How are Black people feeling on the ground, about the new public safety system? How are they as individuals sort of comparing it to the previous system? Do they view it in the same way? How do they trust it more? How are they relating to it differently? And I'm saying this because we can't just look at the data. We also have to talk to the people sort of on the ground. And I think they'll tell us.
So finally, I know a lot of nihilistic and fatalistic Black folks, and I'll be trying to be like, no, we have to have hope and we can do it or whatever. But like in my heart, I'm like, I don't really know. I'm not sure. Do you feel like if we look throughout history, can you definitively say that if you are a 20-something Black woman living today, that you definitively have a better, freer life than a 20-something Black woman living in 1920?
I think in certain ways, there may be aspects that are better about one's life, but there are certain ways that it's the same or it's even worse. But I just don't think that is how people should necessarily determine whether they're going to be nihilistic, whether they're going to be cynical, whether they're going to believe that racism is permanent. There's been so many cases in African American history in which in the history of racism in which the unbelievable happened. We can't forget that racism is less than 600 years old. And so when we think of the life of human history, it's a lot far older than 600 years. And so, racism is actually quite young, especially compared to sexism. And so I think it's critically important for people to just remember that historical perspective. And certainly it's even though we've caught this cancer sort of early, even though we've identified it early, it still has spread to every part of the body politic. And so I completely understand if somebody's like, oh no, there's no chance for survival. But we just have to believe survival is possible in order to go through the pain of treatment. And that's what I sort of believe. And that's what I'm encouraging people to believe, because the greatest Black revolutionaries, the greatest Black change agents in history, somehow believe that they could do the impossible. Yeah. And, you know, and there's no better example of that than of course, Harriet Tubman.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Dr. Kendi, thank you so much for taking some time to talk to me. I appreciate you enormously. I have not read How to Be an Anti-Racist, but I will tell you that Stamped from the Beginning was absolutely transformative. The best 2 weeks of my life reading this. It's very long, but thank you. Thanks so much to Dr. Kendi. I know he is booked and busy right now. He is the racism whisperer for real, so I appreciate him for taking the time. Shout out to the members, shout out to the patrons. The conversations that we're having in those communities right now are what's keeping me going. Leave a comment down below, like, share, subscribe, get some merch, sign up for the email newsletter, wash your hands, continue social distancing if you can, wear a mask. It freaking helps. I will see you next time. Bye.